Well, good morning. I'd like to call the meeting of the Interim Committee's Subcommittee to advise on the expenditure of federal COVID-19 relief funding to order. And Mr. Thorley, would you please take the roll?
Senator Brooks.
Here.
Senator Cannizzaro.
Here.
Senator Kekeffer.
Here.
Assemblywoman Carlton.
Here.
Assemblywoman Howdegi. Assemblywoman Monroe Moreno.
Here.
Assemblywoman Tolles.
Here.
Chair Dondero Loop.
Here. And please mark Assemblywoman Howdegi absent and excused. Thank you very much. Well, good morning again. I'd like to welcome everybody to the first meeting of the Interim Committee's Subcommittee to advise on the expenditure of the federal COVID-19 relief funding. I am Senator Marilyn Dondero Loop, representing Senate District 8, and it is my honor to be selected to chair this subcommittee. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, Congress has provided over $5 trillion in COVID-19 relief funding. Of this total, an estimated $26.5 billion has come to the state as direct aid to Nevadans. This includes economic impact payments, also known as stimulus checks, unemployment assistance through various programs, including federal pandemic unemployment compensation, FPUC, and pandemic unemployment assistance, PUA, and the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP. Another $11.7 billion has been allocated to Nevada in the form of grants and to the state government and local governments of the state. This amount includes grants under coronavirus aid, relief, and economic security CARES Act, such as the Corona Relief Fund, CRF, as well as grants under the American Rescue Plan Act, such as the Coronavirus State and Local Recovery Funds. When you put together this direct aid to Nevadans and the various grants made available through all the federal COVID-19 relief packages, it adds up to an estimated $38.2 billion. This represents an unprecedented amount of money coming in to our economy, schools, universities, workplaces, and state and local government agencies. The focus of this subcommittee will be more about process and less about discussions of how various grants made available to the state of Nevada and local governments should be spent. We will discuss the various pots of money made available to the government agencies and who has authority to accept and expend the money in each budget. We will discuss timelines, deadlines, requirements, and federal guidance. And we will dive into the roles of the different branches of state government and the roles of local governments when it comes to accepting and expending federal COVID-19 relief grant funds. To be sure, there will be some discussion about how funding should be used, but the primary focus of this subcommittee will be to discuss the process. Today, we will hear 4 presentations. First, we will hear from the National Conference of State Legislatures, who will give us a national perspective on the various federal COVID-19 relief packages. Next, we will hear from our fiscal staff, who will provide an overview of the State Budget Act relating to the acceptance and the expenditure of federal funds. Up third will be the Treasurer's Office, who will provide a summary of funding received by the state of Nevada under the American Rescue Plan Act. And the last presentation of the day will be from the Governor's Finance Office, and they will provide information about what the American Rescue Plan Act funding has been distributed and expended to date. So we will start today with public comment. This is the first period of public comment on the agenda. There will be another period of public comment at the end of today's agenda. And because of time considerations, each person offering public comment will be limited to not more than 2 minutes. To join the meeting and make public comment, please follow the instructions outlined on the agenda for today's meeting. And BPS, if you would assist us in opening the public comment line and queuing up the first caller.
Thank you, Chair Don Darrell Loop. If you would like to provide public comment, please press *9 now to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last three digits, 237, please press *6 to unmute. Thank you, caller. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good morning. My name is Marlene Lockard, Lockard, representing SEIU 1107. The COVID-19 pandemic crystallized and exacerbated the plight of Nevada's home care workers. That is why we are requesting funding from the American Rescue Plan to help meet the critical shortage of home care workers, which threaten Nevada's increasing senior population, people with disabilities, and home care workers alike. According to a recent poll taken in Nevada, 75% of workers said, "I may leave home care work eventually because the pay is too low." This, despite the fact that 97% of workers are satisfied with their relationship with their clients. Unsurprisingly, 1 in 2 home care workers in Nevada left the job within a year of taking it. The governor has outlined the state's prioritization bands in the Every Nevadan Recovery Framework. Solving the lack of Nevada's home care workers can be found in the requirements of every one of the prioritization bands: basic needs, community, economy, the quality of life. The economic impact of small business home care providers who currently are unable to meet the demand for more workers is a serious issue. The quality of life for home care workers must be improved through wages, safety protections, training, and incentives. Community support and the basic need for vulnerable Nevadans' access to health and safety care is at the core of the issue. As a result, we feel an appropriation of ARP funds for the home care workers crisis is of the highest and best use of these critical dollars. We appreciate your consideration and the opportunity to speak with you this morning. Thank you very much.
We are currently on
Thank-
public comment. If you have joined the call and would like to provide public comment, please press *9 now to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last three digits, 130, please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Christine Saunders. That's CHRISTINE SAUNDERS, and I'm the Policy Director with the Progressive Leadership Alliance in Nevada. The once-in-a-lifetime federal funds are an opportunity to be bold, visionary, and build for a better future for all Nevadans. One of the most important things we can do is ensure that every Nevadan has a safe and stable place to call home. We appreciate the work the state has done to pass AB 486 and set aside rental assistance, but too many Nevadans are still facing eviction and being displaced by rising rent costs. Just recently, a community member reached out because her rent increased $500. Another called because she's been waiting on CHAP's approval for over 4 months. She logs in every day to check in if she's been connected to a caseworker to move her application forward. We can address these issues by using funds to provide subsidies for tenants who are being priced out of their homes. We can increase the supply of affordable housing by purchasing unoccupied buildings and implementing a housing first model across the state. We can create a civil rights to counsel program to ensure that all tenants have legal support in the eviction process, something the state of Washington recently passed and the city of New York just expanded. Instead of a hearing master that fast tracks evictions, we can increase staffing to CHAP and have a tenant advocate at the county to help navigate the legal process, all while making it simpler to file an answer across the state. There's no better time than now to plan for our future, so the next 7 generations of Nevadans have all they need to thrive in dignity. We look forward to engaging in the process with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. We have one more caller with the last three digits, 832. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good morning, committee members. Thank you. My name for the record is Terry Laird, spelled T-E-R-R-I-L-A-I-R-D. I'm the Executive Director of Arpa, the Retired Public Employees of Nevada. Established in 1976, we currently represent nearly 8,000 dues-paying members and are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We recognize the difficult task you face regarding the billions of dollars in funding relief Nevada received, and realize there are many requests before you from probably all state agencies, as well as many other groups, businesses, and organizations. However, we are asking today that you strongly consider the Public Employees Benefits Program, PEB, due to the extensive budget cuts PEB faced going into the recent legislative session. Long-term disability was eliminated and life insurance was cut yet again for actives and retirees, among other cuts. Healthcare costs are not going down, and these costs have a huge impact on PEB participants. During a recent PEB board meeting, it was revealed the agency expects huge financial impacts from COVID effects on state employees, and so we ask this committee to give serious consideration to PEB when evaluating the hundreds, if not thousands, of claims to come before you in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The public line is open and working. However, there are no additional public comment callers at this time.
Thank you very much. And so now we'll go on to a presentation. The first presentation of the day will be from the National Conference of State Legislatures. And representing NCSL today, we have Emily Mayer, Senior Policy Specialist. And Ms. Mayer, when you're ready, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, Chair Loop and other members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to provide testimony on behalf of the National Conference of State Legislatures. As mentioned, my name is Emily Mayer, and I'm a Senior Policy Specialist with NCSL's Fiscal Affairs Program in Denver. I'm going to share my screen here, so just bear with me. Great, and if there are any issues seeing the slides, please let me know, Amanda. So today I'll be providing an overview of the COVID-19 pandemic federal stimulus packages, specifically honing in on the recent American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, Coronavirus State Fiscal Recovery Funds. My comments today will include details on the eligible use of funds and the ways states are allocating funds. I will also briefly discuss ways states are managing the one-time nature of the funds. So the state budget landscape surely is in a much different place than we all imagined at the onset of the pandemic, at least nationally. After a year and a half, the federal government has authorized billions, if not trillions, in state aid to meet immediate and long-term public health and economic recovery needs. The magnitude of the pandemic relief is historical. There have been 6 different federally enacted funding relief bills, the largest being the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, and the American Rescue Plan Act. Both packages gave states and local governments flexible aid. In total, the combined amount of pandemic federal relief is nearly $5.2 trillion, as the chair pointed out in her opening remarks. And just to hone in deeper on the magnitude of the federal relief, I pulled this chart from the Center for a Responsible Federal Budget, comparing the Great Recession responses versus just the first 3 packages to address COVID-19. Unfortunately, I was unable to find a comparison to include all of the packages, but as you can imagine, this orange bar being more than twice in its size. Many compare just a portion of these packages to the size of the New Deal under FDR. The $1.9 trillion through the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 was designated to provide immediate and direct relief to the economic and health fallout from the pandemic, very similar to the CARES Act. This slide reviews the major funding buckets. The economic impact payments were the largest appropriation in the bill, followed by the state and local aid. The $362 billion includes $350 billion of the state and local fiscal recovery funds, $10 billion towards the capital projects funds, which Treasury just released some guidance around, and $2 billion for the local assistance and tribal consistency fund. Our focus today is on the state portion of those fiscal recovery funds. And before we dive deep into the new flexible funds, I think it's really important to start big picture examining flexible funds under the CARES Act and Arpa. The CARES Act Coronavirus Relief Fund was $150 billion to state, local, and tribal governments. The formula was population-based. And aside from dips and spikes in revenues, the first round of stimulus was pretty fast and furious. States had to act quickly to get those coronavirus relief funds out the door by the initial end of 2020 deadline, which was later extended. In contrast, the state and local fiscal recovery funds are nearly 2.5 times as much as the CRF. The formula is based on population and unemployment rates, which we'll get to in a bit here, and there's a longer time to expend. Recipients have until 2024 to obligate the funds and 2026 to expend. Broadly, these are the large buckets of allowable uses for both packages. There were barriers governments faced with the coronavirus relief funds that were a combination of understanding allowable uses, not being able to address revenues when shortfalls seemed the greatest in 2020, uncertainty over whether a federal package would come to fruition, and that initial impending deadline to spend the coronavirus relief funds within 8 months, which was no easy feat. And by the end of 2020, a lot of states had already expended their CRF by the time that deadline was extended to the end of this year. The fiscal recovery funds are generally more flexible, including broadband, water, and sewer infrastructure, but excluding pensions and tax cuts to offset revenues. The longer expenditure period allows governments to take a breath, create priorities, administer the funds appropriately and effectively. And we'll get to some of the planning aspects in a few slides that states have approached with these funds. And from that process, states have really learned a lot, and I think it's safe to say all levels of governments have. I like to think of the distinction between the CARES and Arpa funds as rescue versus recovery. The state and local fiscal recovery funds are generally more focused on recovery and revitalization. There are, of course, major fallouts and uncertainties around the pandemic, such as the Delta variant, but we've turned over into another phase, one in which states can address and bolster efforts, and it's a little less reactionary. And of course, that longer time to expend gives states a little bit more of a cushion to make decisions. And there are still some barriers with the state fiscal recovery funds that we're seeing playing out, especially around state decisions. Some states are waiting on the final rule of how these funds can be spent to be issued. So the interim rule was issued in May, and there was a comment period, and we're waiting on Treasury to issue that final ruling. In our discussions with Treasury, it doesn't appear that there will be a lot of drastic changes from the interim rule. However, that uncertainty still exists. So shifting our focus to just the fiscal recovery funds under Arpa, another significant aspect of the fiscal recovery funds is the greater threshold of population size for prime recipients. For local governments, more local governments are receiving funding either directly or through the state as a pass-through entity. Specifically, $19.5 billion was devoted from Arpa, separate from the fiscal recovery funds, to support non-entitlement units of local governments, or NEUs, which are local governments typically serving a population under 50,000. In contrast to the CARES Act, according to the National League of Cities, about 30% of local governments did not receive funds under the coronavirus relief funds. So it is a pretty substantial expansion. For states, this means there's less of a nudge to attribute their funds to local government relief. And it also, on the other side of the coin, it means a little less oversight of how local governments are spending their funds. We're seeing a little less of an emphasis on local government relief from the state funding with the fiscal recovery funds in comparison to the coronavirus relief funds as a result. So as I mentioned earlier, the formula to disperse the funds varies from the coronavirus relief funds. As noted in the previous slide, Arpa requires $25.5 billion distributed equally to states and DC, and $160 billion distributed based on unemployment rates. States that experienced a net increase in unemployment rates of more than 2 percentage points were eligible to receive the full disbursement of their first tranche. 19 states and DC received their full disbursement, while 31 states received half of their eligible funds. And in 2022, will receive the remaining amount. Nevada was one of the 19 states to receive their full disbursement. So all in all, the combined full disbursement states and split states accounted for approximately $154.4 billion initially out the door from Treasury. The remaining approximately $40.9 billion will go to states in 2022. For some states, this has affected their timelines to allocate, and we'll come back to that in a bit. To really get a sense for how these funds impact the size of state budgets, I pulled this chart from our partners at the Pew Charitable Trust. As you can see, the amount of ARPA funds in comparison to the size of their state budgets ranges pretty drastically in all states, from Wyoming at nearly 23% to Tennessee at 10% and Wisconsin at 5%. When compared to the size of other state budgets, the aid in Nevada received under ARPA was the third largest, only behind Wyoming and South Dakota. I also think this map really tells a story of magnitude. For example, while California receives the most amount of funding at over $27 billion, their aid accounts for 8% of their budget. While North Dakota is a state that received their full disbursement, and South Dakota, a split disbursement state, will be managing about $1 billion worth, or 14 to 20% of their annual budgets. So the influx of funds, while serving as a lifesaver, is also challenging in its own right to make decisions and ensure those funds are being spent correctly and effectively. One challenge in particular I wanted to pull out was the tension between the legislature and executive on spending authority. As we discussed, there's a significant amount of funds. Both the legislative branch and executive branch would like some input into how these funds are spent. And there has been questions about what these funds are considered. Legislatures, of course, have the authority to spend anticipated federal funds, but things become a little bit more murky when states get these unanticipated federal funds. This became a big issue under the CARES Act, and we saw this issue arise again under these new funds. In some states, the tension between the legislative and executive branches on spending has subsided and collaboration has sort of blossomed. In others, the authority is clear-cut and the decisions are made within one branch or the other. The authority is largely dependent on state laws based on if the legislature is in session, interim actions, or whether the governor has emergency powers over the funds. To date, at least 36 states have allocated their portion of the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds through nearly 900 allocations. We're tracking these funds in a database. In green are states that have taken legislative action. In orange, executive. In Minnesota, Massachusetts, and Wyoming, there has been allocations from both branches marked in a pattern fill. And those states in blue are states that we are not aware of that have made allocations to date. In this slide, I've pulled out 11 categories out of the 15 in our database here to show the large spending buckets of how states are spending their funds. With the flexibility and guidance, more allocations are being devoted to water and sewer infrastructure. We've also seen some of these funds in this area go to local governments or special utility districts as grants. Broadband is a big piece as well. And this was an eligible expense under the CRF. However, with the timeline, there were some barriers to spend those dollars within broadband, and Treasury really expanded the eligible uses within broadband through the fiscal recovery funds. And other categories mirror those under the CRF trends, including economic relief or economic development initiatives, small business and nonprofit assistance programs, education, housing, human services, arts, culture, and tourism, state operations and administration, keeping unemployment trust funds solvent or paying back federal loans, workforce development, and of course, public health is still a major priority, and we're seeing some of these funds devoted more to mental and behavioral health needs in comparison to the CRF. We're also seeing states devote, funds to revenue replacement. This is another bucket that we're kind of tracking, and it's a little difficult to track based on some states' accounting measures. But for example, Alabama just recently used their funds as revenue replacement to build 2 prisons. So that was passed last week. And I also want to emphasize that each state is catering their funds to the specific emergency needs within their state. For example, Alaska created a fund for the Seafood Marketing Institute for trade promotion. Florida devoted funds to the Everglades Restoration Plan. Louisiana created a loggers relief grant program for timber harvesting and timber hauling businesses. And in Maine, they provided support to an electricity grid updates for rural heritage industry projects. You can find more details on allocations and program designs in our database. We're trying to stay as up to date as possible, and I'm more than happy to pass along those details as well. Of the 35 states and the categories outlined previously, here's a breakdown of the number of states allocating funds in each category. Generally, we're seeing a fairly even distribution of allocations amongst those categories. And of course, we expect these numbers to increase as more allocations occur. States are not necessarily devoting funds to every category, nor putting all their eggs in one basket. It really varies across the board. And then some other notable allocations include hazard and premium pay, and allowable use under Treasury's guidelines, funding to pandemic-related positions, for example, limited time contract positions to review and audit funding applications, or positions to administer a broadband connectivity program supported by the funds like they did in New Hampshire, vaccine lotteries and giveaways, efforts to address food banks and insecurity, and relief to childcare businesses and support to families and workers who need childcare. We've seen and are expecting legislative allocations to happen largely under 4 phases as a result of legislative procedures, spending authority deliberations, timing of Treasury's guidance, and the amount of disbursement each state received, whether it was that lump sum or it's split into 2 tranches. There were a few states that made allocations prior to the interim rule in mid-May, such as Florida and Washington, either in budget bills or standalone supplemental appropriations bills. Most states, though, waited until the guidance was released to act. And at the time of the interim rule, many states had adjourned or their legislative procedures were beyond making appropriations with those funds as well. Several states took action as their fiscal year wrapped up. And we are expecting the states that have not acted on those funds and that or have more allocations to make to occur in special sessions later this fall and into the next legislative cycle. Texas is expected to go into a special session, and Georgia, for example, has committees overseeing the funding priorities, and they'll make their decisions in 2022. So as with the coronavirus relief funds, there are various approaches to creating, setting, and implementing priorities over the funds. Here I pulled several examples, and just for the purpose of time, I'm going to give you a brief overview, but you have these slides for details if needed. Some of these strategies include frameworks, creating cash funds, creating bipartisan committees or task forces steered by the governor, and establishing criteria around allocations. Utah scored proposals based on criteria and then divided their funding into 8 large buckets, whereas in Massachusetts, the state is rolling out funds in a 3-phased recovery plan. And with all of these funds and lessons learned from the federal funding during the Great Recession, avoiding the fiscal cliff has really been at the forefront of lawmakers' minds. The tension between reoccurring and non-reoccurring expenses is not new for states. However, the magnitude of these funds makes its significance in thinking critically about managing the one-time expenditures a bit of a challenge. Some states have created separate budget accounts or denote projects separately in their system. We've also heard some states working with local governments and school districts to help them manage the influx of funds that they are receiving, either through the fiscal recovery funds or other buckets within Arpa. And then we're hearing states take on multi-year budgeting practices, leveraging funds for big picture goals, of course, tied to the guidance, having flexibility with the funds and investment strategies, and adjusting for the influx of revenue that the funds have provided to states. And really thinking beyond ARPA will help states avoid that cliff in the long term. So ultimately, it is an unprecedented amount of relief with an opportunity for strategic investment. States are kind of rising to the occasion to make thoughtful decisions so their communities have strong recovery past the pandemic's public health and economic shocks. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present this information to the committee. And I'm more than happy to answer questions. I'll do my best to get you answers.
Thank you so much. That was really valuable information, and we appreciate you attending the meeting today. Members, anyone have questions? And I will try to look through you. I'm going to start with Assemblywoman Carlton. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Ms. Mayor. It's Assemblywoman Carlton. So went through a couple of those slides a little quick. I'm going to go back and review them again. But my biggest question is, are there other states that have committees such as this that are tasked to advise on these funds? I did see the one slide with the different states and the different things, but I wasn't sure what those committees were really doing.
Absolutely, and great to see you, Assemblywoman Carlton. So there are, I can't think of any specific subcommittees, but there are committees that are kind of tackling this in their own right. Rhode Island, for example, their Senate Finance Committee has had some hearings on the subject. In Massachusetts, there is a new, I guess it's a subcommittee created over the summer to provide some guidance around these funds and oversight as well. At the executive level, I mentioned Georgia. Georgia's governor created 3 separate committees to work on different projects, and they are kind of reviewing applications and priorities currently, and they'll be making decisions on those spending decisions in 2022. So there are certainly states that are taking the approach of, a subcommittee or some sort of task force or working group to really make deliberations on these funds. And I'm happy to kind of pull some more examples aside from the ones that are listed on the slide and send them along.
And thank you, Ms. Mayor. That would be really helpful. Some of the states that you listed are full-time states. We're part-time, so we're technically not in session. So we have a little bit of a different dynamic here. And also the other thing I'm curious about, did any of the states do a waterfall type bill like was done in Nevada to kind of give guidance so that if it is a part-time state, as the money comes in, and we know the guidance has changed a lot, and we're trying to navigate that issue also. But do you know if any of the states did a waterfall type bill like Nevada did?
Apologies. Do you mean a waterfall in the sense of appropriating a significant amount of the funds in one bill?
Does passing a piece of legislation that designates how funding as money comes in, how funding needs to be spent? I'd like to think we were innovative, but I'm sure somebody else thought of it too.
Well, I'm not aware of any specific language within bills that have kind of outlined priorities such as Nevada. At the top of my head, I'm happy to do some more digging, but I would say that the approach that Nevada is taking is unique in the way that you are making decisions and allocating those funds and setting priorities.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any additional questions? I don't think I see any. All right. Well, with no more questions, we will move on to our LCB fiscal staff presentation. And presenting with us today are Sarah Kaufman, who is our Assembly Fiscal Analyst, and Wayne Thorley, who is our Senate Fiscal Analyst. And Ms. Kaufman and Mr. Thorley, when you're ready, please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll ask Mr. Thorley to upload our presentation. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, members of the committee. For the record, Sarah Kaufman, Legislative Council Bureau, Fiscal Analysis Division. Today, Mr. Thorley and I have been asked to provide the subcommittee with a summary of the State Budget Act, which can be found under Title 31, Chapter 353 of the Nevada Revised Statutes. And this pertains to the state financial administration. This chapter also provides for the authority that the IFC has during the interim with when the legislature is not in session. So beginning on the second slide, the State Budget Act can be found in Nevada Revised Statutes 353-150 through 353-246. The State Budget Act generally defines the duties of the Chief of the Budget Division of the Office of Finance, otherwise known as the Governor's Finance Office. And this is currently Susan Brown, who will be presenting on agenda item G. The State Budget Act also details the executive budget and how it must be prepared and presented. You all may recall during session, you have received a copy of the executive budget, and it's typically provided for with base, maintenance, and enhancement units. It also establishes procedures for work program revisions that occur after the legislature has adopted a state budget for the biennium. Any agencies need to change something during the interim, there is a mechanism to do that. The State Budget Act creates the Economic Forum and defines the duties of the Economic Forum. And just for a refresher, the Economic Forum is a committee which is made up of 5 non-legislative professionals who are responsible for forecasting the state's major general fund revenues. And finally, the State Budget Act provides that the revenues and other resources of any funds are subject to legislative authorization or appropriation and legislative review for each fiscal year. Next slide, please. The State Budget Act also contains other sections which are within the NRS Chapter 353, and that is they establish the duties of the State Board of Examiners. It details how claims and refunds must be processed. It defines the accounting procedures that must be followed. It also creates various accounts, including the emergency account, the contingency account, the disaster relief account, and the account to stabilize the operation of state government, which is also known as the rainy day account. Chapter 353 explains the process for receipt of gifts and grants. It establishes debt collection procedures, and it also covers the topics related to financial administration of the state. Before the end of each regular legislative session, the legislature adopts several bills that allow the funding and operation of state government for the upcoming biennium. And together, these bills are unofficially referred to as the money bills. They include the Appropriations Act, which makes appropriations from the state general fund to support the operation of state government. The Authorizations Act, which authorizes expenditures by state agencies of funds other than appropriations from the state general fund. The K-12 Education Funding Bill, which provides funding for K-12 public education for upcoming biennium. The Pay Bill, which provides compensation for state employees. The Capital Improvement Program Funding Bill, which provides funding for approved projects within the biennial CIP and for Natural Resource Conservation and Protection Program. And also the Public Employees Benefits Program Bill, which establishes subsidies to provide or to be paid to PEB for health insurance for active and retired state employees. Moving on to the next slide, discusses NRS 353-215, which is work programs establishment. Based on the appropriation of general funds and the authorizations to expend other funds as provided for in the money bills, the budget division of the Office of Finance is required to establish a work program for each department, institution, and agency of the executive branch of state government. Each work program includes all general fund appropriations or other funds from any source made available to the department, institution, or agency for its operation and maintenance and for the acquisition of property. All expenditures made by state agencies from general fund appropriations or other funds from any source must be made in accordance with the agency's established work program. Essentially, a work program establishes revenue collection authority and expenditure authority for each state agency for a given fiscal year. Moving on to the next slide is a discussion on NRS 353-220, the work program revisions. This NRS governs the bulk of the work programs that are typically submitted to the Interim Finance Committee. During a fiscal year, any state agency can request a revision to its work program by submitting a work program revision request to the governor through the chief of the budget division. Every work program revision request must be approved by the governor or the chief of the budget division if the governor delegates the authority to the chief. In other words, the IFC doesn't have the authority to consider a work program revision unless it has already been approved by the governor or the chief of the budget division. There are parameters for what work programs are submitted to the Interim Finance Committee. Work program revision requests must also be reported to and or approved by the Interim Finance Committee if the revision request amount is $30,000 and when considered with all other revisions approved for the fiscal year, increase or decrease by 10% or $75,000, whichever is less, the categorical expenditure level approved by the legislature for any of the allotments within the work program. Moving on to the next slide is a discussion of the types of work program revision requests that must be reported to the Interim Finance Committee. The first is an emergency work program. If a revision is required because of an emergency or for the protection of life and property, the governor shall approve the revision request and report the action along with the reason emergency action was necessary to the Interim Finance Committee. The second type is a 15-day work program, or what we sometimes call a 15-day expeditious. If the governor determines a revision requires expeditious action, the governor may notify IFC of this determination. If the IFC then has 15 days to consider the revision request. Any expeditious action revision request not considered by the IFC within 15 days is deemed to be approved. And finally, the third type of work program is a 45-day work program. And this is essentially the bulk of the requests that come through the Interim Finance Committee. These requests are essentially for any revision requests that do not qualify as an emergency or a 15-day work program, and it must be submitted to the IFC. The IFC then has 45 days to consider the revision request, and any revision request not considered by the IFC within the 45-day period is deemed approved. In acting upon the proposed work program revisions, the IFC shall consider, among other things, the need for the proposed revision, the intent of the legislature in approving the budget for the fiscal year, and originally enacting the statutes which the work program is designated to effectuate. Moving on to the next slide, the acceptance of gifts and grants, which is governed by NRS 353-335. State agencies may accept gifts or grants if it is included in an act of the legislature authorizing expenditures of non-appropriated money. In other words, if there is a reoccurring grant where the authority is provided for in the Authorizations Act, then that doesn't necessarily go to the IFC. However, if there's a new grant that may not have been discussed by the legislature and it is brought to the IFC and it is heard under the provisions of NRS 353-335. If a gift or grant becomes available during the biennium, the governor or the chief of the budget division can approve the acceptance of gifts or grants from non-governmental sources not to exceed $20,000 in value, and governmental grants not to exceed $150,000 in value, as long as the gift or grant is not used for the purposes which involve the hiring of new employees. If a gift or grant becomes available during the biennium and in an amount that exceeds $20,000 for non-governmental gifts or grants and $150,000 in governmental grants, the authorization is to expend the gifts or grants was not approved for action by the legislature, then the process would be to bring forth this to the IFC, the acceptance of gifts and grants, similar to work programs that are provided under NRS 35220. And so you'll see on the next slide, there's language that's very similar to NRS 353-320 in that the types of gifts grants can be requested as an emergency approval, a 15-day approval or a 15-day expeditious, and a 45-day approval. In acting upon a proposed gift or grant, the IFC shall consider, among other things, the need for the facility or service to be provided for or improved, any request or future commitment required by the state, the extent of the program proposed, and the condition of the national economy, as well as any related fiscal or monetary policy. So with that, now I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Thorley, and he is going to discuss with you the practical nature of the State Budget Act.
Thank you, Ms. Kaufman, and good morning, everyone. So for the next several slides, I'll be going through examples of the State Budget Act in practice. So actions that the governor or the Interim Finance Committee have taken and provide some examples of those actions from recent history. So when an unanticipated or unbudgeted federal grant becomes available, such as coronavirus relief funds under the CARES Act, then the requirements to Chapter 353 must be followed. So generally, when IFC approval is required under NRS 353.220, which is the Work Program Revision Statute, and also NRS 353.335, which is the Acceptance of Gifts and Grants Statutes, the item appears on the IFC agenda as a work program revision request. So you'll often see on an IFC agenda a work program revision request to not only revise the agency's work program, so to add expenditure authority related to a grant, but also to bring in new grant funding that was not provided for in the Authorizations Act. A recent example that occurred at the last IFC meeting in August is the Division of Welfare and Supportive Services, the Child Assistance and Development Program. They submitted a work program revision request to revise the work program to add grant revenue authority of $222.4 million, but also to accept that grant revenue also. So approval was provided by the Interim Finance Committee. This was American Rescue Plan Act Child Stabilization Grant funding that the agency plans on making available to child care providers throughout the state. So that authority was given by the IFC under the 45-day work program revision process, which is NRS 353.2205C. There are budget accounts within the state budget that are known as non-executive budgets, and these budgets are exempt from the provisions of the State Budget Act, particularly, and for this example, NRS 353.220, which is the Work Program Revision Statute. But non-executive budgets are not exempt from the provisions of NRS 353.335, which covers the acceptance of gifts and grants. So in cases where there is an unanticipated or unbudgeted grant, or grant funds become available for non-executive budgets, then the process still must be followed in 353.335. So a recent example of that is last spring, when Congress passed the CARES Act and made $836.1 million in coronavirus relief funds available to the state of Nevada. Acceptance of that grant funding was approved by the governor under 353.335 sub 2 sub A. That is the statute that governs emergency acceptance of gifts and grants. So while the IFC did not, since it was the governor determined that emergency existed, the IFC did not vote on that. It was transmitted to the IFC as an informational item last spring. And the reason for which the governor determined that emergency existed and that the grant needed to be accepted was also presented to the IFC. According to the Federal Funds Information for States, or FFIS, over $10.5 billion of federal funding has been allocated to the state of Nevada under the American Rescue Plan Act. Some significant buckets of this total include the $2.7 billion the state of Nevada received in coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. Also, $3.9 billion in economic impact payments or stimulus checks, and $1.1 billion in elementary and secondary school emergency relief or ESSER funds. This $10.5 billion total also includes just over $1 billion in coronavirus local fiscal recovery funds, which are available to local governments in Nevada. Grant funds under the American Rescue Plan Act, so not talking about the stimulus checks, but actual grant funding, can be divided into two main buckets. The coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds, so this is direct aid to the state, and then program-specific grant funds. These are grants that are available to certain state agencies for specific purposes, such as the ESSER grant. And I know that the treasurer later today, when he gives his presentation, will delve into some of these different buckets of money a little bit more. But just wanted to set the table a bit. It's helpful to think of just two buckets of money under ARPA: state fiscal recovery funds, the $2.7 billion, and then the rest of the grant funds. So shortly after sine die of the 81st legislative session, the state physically received the $2.7 billion in coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. The governor, through the chief of the budget division, accepted this grant funding under NRS 353.3352B. This is the statute that allows the governor to determine that 15-day expeditious action is necessary to accept a gift or grant. On June 22nd of this year, which was within the 15-day period, the Interim Finance Committee did meet and approved the acceptance of the $2.7 billion in coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds that was recommended by the governor. The entire amount of this coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds was placed in a non-executive budget account. This is a non-executive budget account that had been previously established the year prior to bring in CARES Act money. No spending of the $2.7 billion occurred in FY21. Of course, this happened right at the end of the fiscal year. So the entire amount was balanced forward into the current fiscal year 22. When the money committees closed the legislative approved budgets for the current biennium, the 2021-23 biennium, the money committees voted to make this non-executive budget account, which had previously been established to account for CARES Act money. They voted to make it an executive budget and rename it the COVID-19 Relief Funding Budget Account 1327 in the state accounting system. And by taking that action, the money committees ensured that this budget account is now subject to the provisions of the State Budget Act. So the various statutes that Ms. Kaufman went over. Senate Bill 459 from the last legislative session, which was the Authorizations Act, included authority in FY22 to establish a work program for this COVID-19 funding relief budget and place the entire $2.7 billion in coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds in a reserve category in the work program. As a result of this action, all expenditure of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds not otherwise authorized for expenditure by the legislature is required to go through the work program revision process pursuant to NRS 353.220. The legislature did pass certain pieces of legislation last session that allowed for state agencies, gave state agencies authorization to expend federal American Rescue Plan Act funding for certain purposes. And one example is Assembly Bill 484, which requires the disbursement of $54 million in American Rescue Plan Act funding to the Department of Employment, Training, and Rehabilitation for upgrading the employment compensation information system for IT upgrades for DETR. I will note that some legislation that the legislature passed last session, while explicitly authorizing American Rescue Plan Act funding expenditures by certain agencies, the legislation did include language that said the requests still need to go through the provisions of the State Budget Act. So some of these, you'll have seen some work program revisions come through at prior IFC meetings for actions that the legislature already took, but the legislation did require the executive branch to still follow the work program revision process. So in some cases, the legislation just said, hey, you have authority to do this. So the didn't need to go through the State Budget Act process. In other cases, while the legislation authorized authority, it still said you must go through the State Budget Act. And so those go through the work program revision and IFC process. At the most recent meeting of the Interim Finance Committee in August, the committee approved 13 work program revision requests under NRS 353.220 sub 5 sub C. Again, this is the 45-day work program revision process that Ms. Kaufman discussed. Those 13 work program revision requests totaled 287.5. That should be million. I'm sorry, that's not billion. Typo in the slide. In American Rescue Plan Act funds. Director Brown, I know in her presentation later today, we'll get into more additional work program revision requests that have been submitted. I just wanted to give the committee just an overview of what they've seen already. These 13 work program revision requests from August IFC, they did not include any of the $2.7 billion in coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. There were other work program revisions submitted to expend money out of that bucket, but this 13 that I'm discussing was from the other bucket, the non-coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds bucket. And for the upcoming IFC on October 21st, the Governor's Finance Office has submitted several additional work program revision requests under the 45-day work program revision process relating to American Rescue Plan Act funding. So those work program revision requests for American Rescue Plan Act funding are still coming. The expenditure of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds that are currently sitting in reserves can occur either through the work program revision process. So the governor or an executive branch agency can submit a request to the governor to revise their work program to move this money out of reserves to an expenditure category. And then that could go to IFC for approval, or the legislature during a session of the legislature, a special session or a regular session, during a special session, if authorized by the proclamation, could adopt legislation to authorize the expenditure of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. So similar to legislation that was passed last session, the legislature could pass additional legislation during a future legislative session. As American Rescue Plan Act grant funding continues to be made available, by the federal government. Work program revision requests will continue to be submitted to IFC following the work program revision process in NRS 353.220. Lastly, I just wanted to briefly discuss the limits of the authority of the legislative and executive branch governments when it comes to the authorization and expenditure of some of the funding that's made available to local governments and school districts under the American Rescue Plan Act. So as I mentioned previously, local governments in Nevada have been awarded just over $1 billion in coronavirus local fiscal recovery funds under the American Rescue Plan Act. Also, under ESSER, there's been 3 rounds of ESSER now. They're under the CARES Act, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, and the American Rescue Plan Act have all allocated ESSER funds to the state of Nevada. In total, that adds up to $1.7 billion. At least 90% of all ESSER funding must be subgranted directly to local educational agencies or LEAs. So this includes your school districts and the state public charter school authority. So the vast majority of ESSER funding is going straight to school districts and charter schools. The state government does not have authority over coronavirus local fiscal recovery funds. So these are the dollars going to the counties and city governments in the state. Nor does it have authority over the 90% of ESSER funding that goes directly to local school districts and charter schools. That simply has to be made available by the State Department of Education, which is a state educational agency, as a subgrant to the school districts and charter schools. And then those school districts and charter schools make determinations within the guidance that they've received from the U.S. Department of Education about how to spend those dollars. That's it for our presentation, and Ms. Kaufman and I would be happy to answer any questions that the committee members might have about the State Budget Act or how it works in relation to federal grants.
Thank you so much to both of you. That's a lot of really great information. And I would ask if anybody has any questions. I really appreciate the depth and the expertise that you presented us. Any questions? Senator Brooks.
Thank you, Chair Dondero Loop. And this is a question for Mr. Thorley or Ms. Kaufman on the monies that are currently in the reserve category and in the reserve account. Are those subject to spending by 2026, and then having to allocate them by 2024?
Senator Brooks, Wayne Thorley for the record. That's correct. So the money that's in that reserve category in budget account 1327 is coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds, and that funding is subject to commitment for expenditure by the end of December 2024, and then actually fully spent by 2026, end of 2026.
Thank you. And thank you for the presentation. This is incredibly helpful. It distills everything, all the questions we've been asking for the last couple of years down into a couple of slides, and it's easy to digest. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Mr. Thorley.
Oh, no, I didn't have anything else to add, Chair.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Any additional questions from the committee? And if I'm not seeing you, just unmute and speak up.
Madam Chair.
Yes, please go ahead, Senator Keykeeper.
Thank you. To follow up on Senator Brooks's question, do those same timelines apply to the revenue offset funds that are now in our state general fund?
Wayne Thorley for the record. Senator Kekeffer, thank you for the question. The revenue or coronavirus, the funding that was designated as lost revenue came from the coronavirus state fiscal recovery fund. So yes, it is subject to the same expenditure deadlines as all other money coming from the coronavirus state fiscal recovery fund.
And those, the appropriation of those dollars would require action by the full legislature at this point, right? They can't be processed through a work program.
So Senator Kekeffer, I'm going to ask LCB Legal if they might be willing to jump on now and provide a quick statement regarding that.
Yes, thank you. This is Brian Fernley, Legislative Counsel. I apologize, my video is not working today, but the audio is working. The short answer to that question is no. That would not require full action by the legislature. The Authorizations Act that was passed in SB 459 from the 2021 session authorized the expenditure of roughly $2.8 billion in COVID relief funds. So that is the legislative authorization, SB 459 from the 2021 session. That is the legislative authorization to spend that money. The money currently is in the, but expenditure of that money would require work program revisions to be submitted to the IFC. So a subsequent action by the legislature is not needed to spend that money because SB 459 already authorized the expenditure of that money.
That's is that a different interpretation, Mr. Fernley, than we heard earlier in the summer?
I don't believe so. I wasn't aware of the interpretation earlier in the summer. But it is SB 459 has the authorization to spend $2.8 billion in coronavirus relief funds. Certainly, a legislature could, a special session or a regular session could take action to further spend that money, but another action by the full legislature would not be required because of that authorization to spend $2.8 billion in SB 459.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Assemblywoman Tolles.
Yes, thank you so much, Chair. And I had a similar question because it was my understanding that in looking at the U.S. Treasury FAQs, the document, I think it's about 46 pages or so, it talks about one of the allocations is to be able to recuperate the lost revenue. And that, as I understood it from SB 459 was, we allocated prioritizing to certain pots, but that, and maybe I'm wrong, I was under the impression also that we needed to have the full legislature convene to make a decision on the recuperation of those revenues. And from what I understand, the U.S. Treasury estimated that the loss of revenues from 2020 was 1.086 billion. So I guess my question is, could we have something formally in writing to clarify that?
Yes, absolutely. We are working on a written document that lays out exactly what the authority of the legislature and the IFC and the governors with respect to this money. And that, yes, we will provide that.
Thank you. That would just be so helpful. I think it's just important that we're all officially on the same page on that. And then, Madam Chair, if I could just ask a follow-up question procedurally.
Please, go ahead.
Thank you. So I know that we allocated certain dollars, for example, in the legislative session for use of learning loss programs, for example. And I'm just wondering when we can start to allocate those. It's my understanding we haven't allocated those specific funds. Are we waiting for further action, or do we have the ability to allocate those funds since we already voted on and passed that in the 81st legislative session?
Madam Chair, for the record, this is Sarah Kaufman. Yeah, so any legislation that was provided for or was approved by the legislature that did not require the further consideration by the Interim Finance Committee can move forward. So there are areas where Senate Bill 461 had some direct allocations. And I think Ms. Brown will be talking about some of those in a follow-up agenda item, I believe item G. She'll be talking about some of the distribution expenditures. And so, yes, those are currently in the works. I believe right now the unemployment insurance loans have already been paid off. And so that's just an example of one of the items that was already provided for that has moved forward.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the follow-up question.
Thank you very much. And I believe that Majority Leader Canizero has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and also thank you, Sarah and Wayne, for a really excellent presentation that I think made it very easy for all of us to kind of follow, and just really well done. I just had a quick question of the state funds that we have that have come to us. How much of that has not currently already been allocated and accounted for? Do we know how much that is?
Senator Canizaro, Wayne Thorley for the record. Are you talking about the coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds at the $2.7 billion?
Yes, I'm sorry. I should have been a little clear about that. Yes.
No problem. I can give you a rough estimate. So of the $2.7 billion, approximately $1 billion was identified as lost revenue. Another 700 to 800 $1 million was authorized for expenditure through various pieces of legislation passed the last legislative session, or through the work program revision process. That leaves roughly 900 million to about $1 billion of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds that haven't been identified as either lost revenue or for expenditure for authorized purposes.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Any additional questions from anyone? Senator Brooks? Yes, please go ahead.
This is Senator Keffer.
Oh, sorry. I
still have a follow-up?
Yes, please go ahead. I could not see your picture. I could only hear a voice. So please go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to sort of follow up on the issue of how mechanically we would allocate funds that are currently sitting in our general fund. If work programs are to augment existing budget items, how do we then transfer money out of our general fund to do something that isn't augmenting an existing line item? I mean, how do we process a work program for something that doesn't exist? For example, if we wanted to do something new with the $1 billion that's sitting in the general fund.
Senator Keffer, Wayne Thorley for the record. Is that a question for legal or fiscal staff or just anybody that can answer?
I think anybody who can answer it, Wayne.
Mr. Fernley, I don't know if this might be more appropriate for you to answer.
Yes, I can answer that. So going back to SB 459, it does say that it does authorize the expenditure of approximately $2.8 billion. And that it does say that it is authorizing the expenditure of sums not appropriated. So there is authorization to spend that $2.8 billion. The mechanics of how exactly we are going to do that, or how that could be done, we haven't completely sorted out yet. But I think that would be something that we'd have once we have a written opinion on the issue.
I appreciate it. If you could just keep me in the loop when that comes out, I would greatly appreciate it.
Certainly.
Thank you very much. I believe Assemblywoman Carlton has a question.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Senator Keffer addressed it briefly. So I think that probably answers my question. Thank you very much. But if I could, one last thing. So
Go ahead.
In the conversations earlier about being able to, the emergency provisions, which, you know, we've not used very often, but sometimes we do. So I want to give an example and get an answer on whether that would be acceptable or not. So let's say we have a mental health crisis in Southern Nevada and we don't have enough beds, or we have beds but not enough professionals, and we need to do something about that in an emergency situation. The governor would be able to, and the GFO would be able to propose a work program to the legislature through the emergency section to be able to deal with certain things. So if we did have emergencies in the future, public health, public safety, whatever, those could be declared an emergency and then those dollars could be used. Am I correct?
Madam Chair, through you to Assemblywoman. Yes, that is correct. If these funds are provided for in an operating budget, the governor's finance office through an emergency appropriation emergency allocation of this funding can use that funding and then report to the IFC at its next meeting the actions that were taken and why it was determined to be an emergency.
And thank you very much, Madam Chair. And if I could do another quick follow-up. So we know the FAQs have changed a lot over the last couple of months. We know that getting money to DETR to update and modernize their system was very important. And we did address that. But I'm now hearing from the Department of Labor that there might be another, our wonderful word tranche now, another tranche of money to deal with that. Ms. Kaufman, Mr. Thorley, so if another funding stream becomes available to fund that, would it be possible for the legislature to use the term that I've learned from you all, change the color of that money, pull back those other dollars that we spent, use that designated tranche to do it, and then therefore open up the use of those dollars to possibly go to another need in the state? Is that a possibility?
So the one example I can think of in terms of being able to do that is the tobacco settlement fund. So during the interim, tobacco settlement funds can't be appropriated directly from the fund. However, if there is a savings associated with that in a specific budget, then those can offset something that might be related to a tobacco settlement fund eligible use. And so those are some instances that I've seen where funds that maybe weren't directly allocated for that purpose were then used and because of a savings. Am I understanding the question correctly?
We're almost there. It's my understanding that there might be other dollars to possibly fill some of the other holes that we've had. And thank you, Madam Chair, for being able to follow up again. And I just want to make sure that if there are other dollars available to suit a need that we've already tried to address, would we be able to go ahead and use those dollars and pull the other dollars back? If that's not something we can answer today, I think it is something that we're going to want to get a handle on, because I think there's going to be more changes and more dollars. There's different funding streams out there. And I just want to make sure that if we need to do a switch, that would be possible. And I can pose the question to Ms. Brown also, or Ms. Mullenkamp later on, or have legal look into it as we move forward. I just want to make sure we have all the opportunities possible to use these dollars. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your questions. Any additional questions from the committee? I don't believe I see any. So with that, thank you, Mr. Thorley and Ms. Kaufman. If we have additional questions, I'm sure we know where to get a hold of you. So thank you very much. And with that, I think that we will move on to the next agenda item, which is the Treasurer's Office. And we are honored to have with us today Nevada State Treasurer Zach Conine. Treasurer Conine is joined by Kristen Van Rye, Chief of Staff, and Eric Jimenez, the Chief Policy Deputy. And please, Treasurer, go ahead when you're ready.
Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. Confirming you can all hear me, right? Getting some nods. Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm going to ask Kirsten Van Rye, my Chief of Staff, to put up the deck, if you would, okay? Perfect. Thanks so much. So we're here today and we're leading out in front of GFO, so we can tell you what's coming in, and GFO can tell you what has already been done. I want to thank Wayne and Sarah for setting us up so nicely on some of these buckets. Really appreciate it. Also, I expect between our team and your fiscal team and GFO that no state employees have ever said the word buckets as many times as we have over the last 6 months. Slide, please. So ARPA, just from a real quick background, we won't spend too much time here. The American Rescue Plan Act was signed by the President on March 11th. HR 1319, it included nearly $2 trillion in national aid through hundreds of separate programs and initiatives. And to Assemblywoman Carlton's point, all of those different programs and understanding where they go and what they do is a big piece of the work that we have in front of us. The aid comes in a number of different ways, and Wayne spoke about this briefly, but just to give a little bit more detail, there's 4 types of aid as we think about it. One is direct aid. That's funding flowing directly to Nevadans, the stimulus payments, the additional payments that went out through the Federal Pandemic Unemployment Compensation, or FPUC, that additional $300 a week, the child tax credit, dollars that went down to buy down the exchange premiums and the rest. Those are dollars that the state didn't have any control of, but they did go to benefit Nevadans. I'd specifically point out the child tax credit single-handedly lifting tens of thousands of Nevada families out of poverty. Then we have non-discretionary, quasi-discretionary, and discretionary aid. And this speaks to how much control the state has at any level, legislatively or through programmatic, or through, in the case of ESSER grants, what the education districts, the school districts can do with these monies. Non-discretionary is funding to existing and new programs where we have almost no control over it. These are plus-ups, things like the additional money that went into the WIC program. We can, I suppose, choose not to take it, but we can't choose how it gets spent. Quasi-discretionary aid is funding to existing or new programs where we have some level of control in those funds. Best example I can give here is rental assistance. So we had to use the rental assistance dollars that came in through the ARP Act, what is called ERA2, or Emergency Rental Assistance 2, for rental assistance. But we had some choices. We could choose whether or not it went directly to the tenants or the landlords. We could choose how much time the process took before we had to move on to other backup processes. We could choose what constituted giving the proper documentation, the rest. Again, all within Treasury guidance, but we had some choices to make programmatically. And then discretionary aid is primarily the state and local relief funds, as well as the capital improvement projects bucket, which we'll talk about in a little bit. These are fundings where the legislature and the governor have a massive amount of control, again, within guidance, which is a fair amount of guidance. Slide, please. As of today, and I say as of today because this number would have been different last week and it would have been different the week before, we have 106 known buckets of funding to the state of Nevada. again, doesn't include those direct payments like the stimulus payments or FPUC or the money that is coming in through the child tax care credit. These are individual programs that exist at a different agency, some at the same agency at the federal level, and will be handled differently at the state of Nevada level after they're accepted. We have 72 of those buckets. We know how much the state allocation amount is. 34 of those buckets, we don't. We don't have any guidance. We don't have any money, but we know that it's listed within the bill as receiving additional funds. Functionally, and you know how large your state government is, we are relying on FFIS, as Wayne mentioned, the federal funds information for states, to provide us a little bit of details about the dollars that are expected. To date, they've been right across the board. Obviously, they make adjustments along the way, but we don't have the resources to go into those additional 34 buckets and calculate what we expect the funds will be. Mechanically, they started with some of the largest ones and moved down. So we expect that those 34 buckets, while providing millions of dollars to the state, probably won't provide hundreds of millions of dollars to the state. Categories of aid, and we'll go through these a little more in depth, but there are 12 categories of aid. Now, these are categories that we have created internally within the Treasury and the Governor's Finance Office, to think through the types of funding that are coming in. But there are obviously overlap. There are dollars within healthcare that are healthcare for educational facilities, et cetera, right? So these are internal buckets to help us get our handle around it. And those helped us create this next slide, which is Nevada's share of known funding. So we already talked about the state general aid, that 2.738837.228 spot 70. That's the green bucket at the bottom, the 2.7 that we speak to. The blue bucket at the 9 o'clock region is the local general aid. That's at 1.04. And we've got a breakdown. We can certainly talk through it. But as Wayne and Sarah mentioned, that money is primarily tranched. So all of the states receive, or all the local governments received half of their money. Most of that money flowed directly into the local governments, the counties and the states. 75 million, 150 in total, but 75 in the first tranche flowed through the state for things called non-entitlement units, which are effectively cities that fell underneath the population count, where Treasury would deal with them directly. We don't have any control over that 75 million. There was just a mechanical process to make sure it got out the door, and GFO could certainly speak a little bit more towards that. And the rest of the buckets you can see along the top. And so when we're talking about, so that last number, the total number, is $6,696,629,506.39. I do apologize to someone in Carlton. That was 88 cents for a long time, but there was an adjustment in it. So the little change there. I know you've been watching that part of it. So you can see some of the different buckets, and we'll talk about those. And that's why, when we talk about the money coming into the state, we do talk about holistically. Not because the state has direct control over the education dollars. We don't have direct control over the local general aid. And a lot of the other money is very programmatic. It can only be used for one thing. But it all represents the coordination efforts that are out there. We want to make sure that the state, for instance, isn't spending the same dollars to fix the problem that a local government is spending. That if 5 local governments are doing the exact same thing, we want to encourage some coordination there. And avoid something that happened during the Coronavirus Relief Fund process, the CRF process, which is duplication of efforts, right? Where, I think there were 7 or 8 small business aid programs, a lot of which were contradictory, right? They had different timelines, different dollar amounts. Some, if you applied for, say, pets before you applied for one of the Clark County programs, you couldn't get the Clark County program. But if you applied for the Clark County program before pets, you could get both. So we're trying to avoid those things through communication and coordination. Slide, please. Excuse me. State and local fiscal relief funds, as was discussed, 2.7 billion for state, 1.04. 1.04 for local. Sorry. The interim final rule was published originally in May, along with 42 pages of FAQs. Those FAQs have been amended about 13 times since they were released on May 17th. And the interim final rule, of course, is the interim final rule. We're still waiting on the final one. To NCL's point early on, we don't expect significant changes. And there is a level of protection if you make a decision, if a spending decision is made under the interim final rule, and then that final rule changes into the final rule, as long as you are within the guidance at the time that the decision is made, you are eligible. And that's from both the Treasury and the White House, basically to encourage removal of some of the fear that was present, I think, for all of us during the coronavirus relief fund process, where we would make a decision or think we had made a decision, and then the guidance would change the next day, and we would perhaps be out of compliance or be worried about being out of compliance. There are 4 allowable uses under the guidance. The first 3 are for that entire 2.7 or the 1.04. Public health and economic impacts, obviously very broad, right? In what could be public health, what could be economic impacts. Premium pay, so the providing of premium pay for employees, perhaps in hazardous conditions or for any other reason. Investments in infrastructure, primarily in the guidance, it speaks to broadband, wastewater and clean water infrastructure. There, of course, is a separate infrastructure package working its way through Washington right now, which would create perhaps more spending, definitely more spending for things like roads and bridges, what you consider hard infrastructure, broadband, et cetera. And then the 4th is provision of government services. And I put that out broadly to the side there to the extent of revenue loss. So functionally, as Wayne and Sarah described, there's a calculation that needed to be done early on in the process where we decide based on the work of GFO and the work of your fiscal staff, what revenue loss was. And there's a number of different points that you calculate revenue loss, but at the end you get to a number. And that number has additional flexibility in how you can spend it, right? And the flexibility broadly is described as the provision of government services, which in conversations with the White House, with the Treasury, and with other states, folks are basically thinking very broadly as to what government does, right? And so that could be a lot of things that wouldn't necessarily fall into the first 3 buckets. Now, the prohibitions, things like using the money to pay lawsuit settlements, putting it directly into the rainy day fund, using it to pay severance payments, using it to shore up pensions, using it to pay for existing debt service. Those prohibitions are on everything. That doesn't change with the provision of government services, but it does give us a little more flexibility. K through 12 education, as Wayne and Sarah mentioned, is in the hands of our Department of Education as well as the school districts. They've submitted a plan, which is available online, that I encourage anybody to read. That's primarily those ESSER dollars. There are 7 programs. We have funding information for all of them, and in total, it's about $1.18 billion. The plan was approved by the Treasury. This is one of the few plans, and I'll call it out here because I think it's important. Most of our reporting and requirements to Treasury are backward looking. We make a decision, legislature, governor make a decision on how these things are going to be spent. We go and spend them. We report that that's what we've spent. And if there's a concern, it comes up through the audit process. In this case, the U.S. Department of Education had to approve those plans preliminarily before dollars went out the door. And there were requirements there about equity and inclusion, making sure that underinvested communities were invested in, and the rest. Slide, please. Next bucket, family assistance, 389 million in total. There's 16 programs. We have funding details received for 14 of those programs. Wide variety of things, and happy to go into any more detail here, but things like child abuse prevention state grants, our Title VII ombudsperson, which is elder abuse prevention, emergency food and shelter programs, and family violence prevention. Housing, a total of $339 million. Funding has been received, or funding details have been received for 6 of the 9 programs. That includes that emergency rental assistance that we spoke about. Just from a rental assistance perspective, we've got about $500 million statewide through the 3 programs. So the money that was allocated during the CARES from the Coronavirus Relief Fund, ERA 1, which passed from the December Consolidated Appropriations Act, which is called the December bill, and the dollars that have come in through Arpa. And as of the last count, the state of Nevada is 10th in the nation for percentage of funds out the door, which of course was a collaborative effort between a lot of people, but worth mentioning that it's going relatively pretty well. Slide, please. Transportation, $346 million. There's 5 programs. We have the details received for all, and those are primarily in FTA programs and a few dollars going to airports and the rest. And we have, just in case anyone wants it afterwards, we're happy to send it. I think your fiscal staff has it, kind of the breakdown of all of these 5 bucket and dollar amounts. We're happy to share that as well, of course. Healthcare, 235 million, 38 programs. This is one of the ones where we have the biggest gap between programs that we know about versus programs that have gotten dollars. And those range from family planning to public health laboratory preparation, nursing home strike teams. And there's a lot of different programs that flow in through this, which of course isn't surprising in the midst of a pandemic. Higher education, $214 million, primarily through the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, or HEERF, that are dollars that have gone out to the universities directly. Most of the universities have put a plan together on spending them. Most of those plans are around aid directly to students, some budget replacements to make up for budget dollars cut during the last cycle, mostly those 2 buckets. There are some other buckets out there, and I'm sure NG could provide additional information if need be, but most of those funds have been allocated, if not spent. Capital Projects Fund. This one's a little different, so I'll spend a little more time here. It's $135 million, has its own set of guidance. Most of these programs have guidance, but that guidance is about the existing program that is being plussed up or slightly adjusted. This is a brand new program administered out of Treasury. Guidance was published about 15 days ago or so for the $135 or so million that are coming in. It is a fund specifically for capital investment projects that help out dealing with communities who were impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, with a primary focus on broadband. It's not a universal focus on broadband. It can be used for other purposes, but broadband from a guidance perspective is assumed to be allowable. And then other programs have a series of tests. But you can see the 3 criterion. The projects need to be, in order to be eligible, capital projects investments in capital assets designed to directly enable work, education, and health monitoring. And it's specific to work, education, and it's an inclusive phrasing, right? So a project that just did health monitoring would not be appropriate, but a project that did work, education, and health monitoring, for instance, a community multi-purpose center, would meet all of those purposes. Next slide, please. Economic development. 2 projects here coming in for $92.1 million. We have funding details for one of them, but we've got a general idea of both. The State Small Business Credit Initiative, for those who don't know, is a program that exists. That's an ongoing program that helps provide small businesses startup and ongoing capital at the state level. Really successful program, pretty small, about $13 million or so coming into that program. GoEd is administering both of these and working through the process. And then the Economic Development Assistance Programs is a set of both competitive and non-competitive grants. And so GoEd has been putting a team together that is preparing to submit the preliminary application. It's a 2-stage application process where we apply broadly, then get into the short list, and there's a fair amount of work to do to get the final grant funding. But GoEd, in combination with the Nevada System of Higher Education, the local RDAs and workforce groups have been working to put a plan together there. I'll highlight that as the type of coordination that absolutely is necessary as we go through this. In past funding rounds, things like ARA, we had a suboptimal result in some ways because local governments in the state weren't communicating as much as they needed to. And so competitive projects would both be submitted for the same thing or for the same type of thing nearby. And because these are reviewed, it is a competitive process. You go out of your way to try to make sure that you're not competing against yourselves. And so that work is being done, and we're generally optimistic about the result. Slide, please. Food assistance, $24 million coming in. We've gotten 7 programs, funding details received for 5, and that is the aforementioned WIC cash voucher increase, as well as some purchasing and tech improvements for SNAP. And so again, from a coordination expert piece, and then to get back to Assemblywoman Carlton's question from earlier about how do we make sure, the importance of making sure that we don't spend less flexible dollars or more flexible dollars on less flexible dollars opportunity. In other words, we don't use the cash when we could use the gift card. That's why we're reviewing all these programs and making sure that if increases to, say, for instance, if through the Every Nevada Recovery Framework or through the Nevada Recovers Listening Tour, comments were made about improving online purchasing through SNAP, that we make sure that these dollars get spent towards that purpose first before there's an application or desire to use the more flexible dollars. Slide, please. Miscellaneous. There are some programs that just didn't fit into a calculation. There's 15 programs. We have details received for 6. These are relatively small in general in the big scope of the bill, but there's air pollution grants, National Endowment for the Arts. There's some dollars in there for firefighters and state commissions on community service, as well as another 9 or so programs. Slide, please. And so I'll stop there and see if we've got any questions about buckets before we move on into the listening tour and sort of our response to the Treasury guidance about making sure that we speak to communities and get feedback on how these dollars could be directed. Any bucket questions?
Thank you very much. Any questions from the committee at this point?
Madam Chair?
Yes.
This is Assemblywoman Tolles.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Treasurer. Good to see you. And I know you've been very busy over the last month or so. I'm going back to slide 15 and the Capital Projects Fund. And could you just help us understand what type of project would be eligible? It seems awfully restrictive to be able to meet all those criteria if it's an and, not an or. So maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but could you just give us some examples of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're happy to follow up with some more examples down the road. But the two that are sort of outlined within the guidance is projects that are broadband related, right? So whether it's bringing broadband to an area that doesn't have broadband, providing equipment or devices or connectivity within an area, right? All would be within the guidance. That's sort of the black letter law is that broadband is allowable. The other thing they mention are multi-purpose community facilities. So for instance, when you look at enable work, education, health monitoring, a central location in a community that could provide both telehealth services, could provide workforce services. So for people who needed to telework, but didn't necessarily have the connection at home, right? Or lived in a rural or frontier area where they couldn't have access to connection. And same thing on the education front, right? So the concept of a centralized location where people could access remote services would fall within the guidance. Other things could be within the guidance, but they have to meet all of those criteria. It's I would say that while those are relatively flexible dollars within the things that they're allowing you to do, there are options, kind of off ramps into other types of capital projects, but they're really encouraging. The guidance really encourages a focus on broadband and those multi-purpose community centers.
Thank you. Just a follow-up clarifying question, make sure I understood correctly. So, Madam Chair.
Please go ahead. I'm having just a little trouble with my connection, so please go ahead.
Thank you. So just to be clear, you couldn't just have, let's say, a clinic that's set up to deal with health and substance use disorder standalone. It would also have to include an education component. And conversely, you couldn't just have an education program that maybe provides a facility for after-school tutoring if it doesn't also have a health component. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's our read of the guidance. Something that we don't know, and a question that is being posed to Treasury is sort of what is the percentage of functionality that needs to be available? In other words, if there was an office space that could be used for telehealth appointments that was private and reservable in advance by healthcare providers, would that satisfy the health component of the piece, or would you need an RN or someone else on staff in order to be able to do it? Another piece that is within the guidance is that the purpose of the facility wouldn't need to be limited just to those purposes. In other words, you could build a facility that did those purposes, but also had a community center, or you build a facility that did those purposes, but also had a childcare facility or a library or whatever that community needed. But it does need those components.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate you taking a little more time on that one.
Okay, if there are no more questions, please go ahead, Treasurer.
Perfect. Let me get back to that slide. Okay, so in conversations, when you read the Treasury guidance, one of the things that's deeply clear is that the Treasury and the White House are intending for this to be a process unlike past spending decisions processes, right? In other words, that they expect, and I think this word has been said a lot recently, but they expect an unprecedented opportunity to elicit an unprecedented response. And you're seeing different states through the NCL presentation do different things, right? Nevada chose to be as inclusive as humanly possible. And so we put together during the end of the legislative session, just to kind of how we got here, the Every Nevada Recovery Framework, which is a collaboration between legislative leadership, the governor's office, and our office to set forward an ethos for these coming federal dollars without the guidance in front of us and not knowing exactly what was allowable and not, right? So you'll notice that that's a relatively broad document. And then from that, we wanted to make sure in order to provide the data required from a Treasury responsiveness perspective. And so, and I know GFO will talk a little bit more about this, but broadly, the level of reporting around these dollars, specifically the 2.7, but also a number of those other 104 buckets, is much more significant than historic, than the amount of reporting that we had to provide. It's much more, arguably double or 3 times more than the reporting we had to provide for the coronavirus relief funds, right? And the narrative, the mechanic that they want us to go through is effectively creating a journey line for these ideas. And so the Treasury wants to see, tell us about how you got the data, through which decisions were made, tell us where you got that data, how you got that data, how the process of getting that data was as equitable as possible, and specifically reached out to communities that have been historically underinvested in, disenfranchised. How then that data informed decision-making and how decisions were made from that data, what the expectation was about what the outcome of those decisions would be, and then finally, was that outcome the actual outcome, the extent that it's measurable. And so this is a very data-driven process. And in order to create kind of a backbone for that data, we created the Nevada Recovers Listening Tour. It's a 75-day, 75-event tour. Currently, we're on day 64, and event to date is 92. Now, that does include 58 listening events, what you've seen from the roundtable perspective, 21 local and travel presentations. We thought this was really important to make sure that we went out to the counties large and small, to the cities large and small, and offered to explain what process the state was going through, and as importantly, make sure that they know that we're interested in both collaboration and data share, because we have received through this process thousands of ideas. Some of those ideas are very functionally a county thing, right? It's repairing of a county road, it's fixing up a county health center or a city thing. And so we're able to pass that information on to them as we've asked them to pass information on for things that should probably be state initiatives, for instance, broadband, right? It doesn't make sense for us to have 17 different broadband plans, one for each county, and then additional ones that are city specific. So part of this tour, right, a big piece, about a third, or a quarter, excuse me, so far of the meetings have been around telling people the process that we're going through and why, to encourage their participation. Everything that we do on this tour drives people to nevadarecovers.com, which is where all ideas come from. So every idea through this process is intended from a data collection and meeting the Treasury guidance. Every idea that comes in goes through that portal. Now we have ways for individuals in our community who don't have access to the internet to submit ideas and to fill out surveys. That is available in English and Spanish, and we've got partners who are willing to help for communities who speak other languages outside of English and Spanish, which we know is a big portion of the population here in Nevada, to make sure their ideas can be captured. And as always, we're deeply appreciative to our chambers, our faith leaders, our union halls, and the rest for helping us spread the word about it. But all of these efforts are to drive ideas and survey results through nevadarecovers.com so that we are able, at the end of this process, to turn over a relatively comprehensive data package to the second stage, which I know we're going to talk about more at the next meeting. But the second stage was effectively to take those 106 buckets of funding and make sure we're spending them in the most effective way, right? To look at what other states are doing, to compare what the state typically does as far as receiving federal funds to what could be done now that we've got the resources in order to implement that work, and to make sure that at the end of this, we have not just an effective as the governor put it, investment versus spending of these billions of dollars, but also to make sure that we've got a resource list in front of us so that for future packages as they come in, whether it's the infrastructure bill or the social infrastructure or reconciliation bill, both of which within luck will pass and bring billions of dollars of support to Nevada, but also as a resource for the legislature and the governor and anyone else who's making a decision on the local and city level, so that they know here's what your community said, right? Here's what's out there. Here are the needs that have been expressed. Here are the ideas. And we know, and the Treasury guidance directs us to help find solutions within the community. In other words, that the rules, the guidance around it is not to make a decision on what would help a community without actually talking to the community. And so this is part of that process. I'll stop there. Happy to take any questions, and I appreciate you all squeezing us in before we go to Tonopah in a few moments.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry if you cannot see me, I'm having a slight technical problem. So if you are asking a question, please let me know verbally because I cannot see any of you on my screen. Can you hear me? Treasurer
Yes.
Conine, okay, you can hear me, you just can't see me.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so if anybody has any questions, would you please just let me know verbally?
Chair Dondero Loop, I can see the whole gallery and no one seems to have any questions right now.
Okay, thank you very much, Senator Brooks. I appreciate that. Okay, Treasurer Conine, any additional information you'd like to share?
No, I just really want to thank members of this committee and other members of the legislature, the fiscal staff, GFO. It's been, I would say, a Herculean lift, and it's not anywhere close to done. So I appreciate everybody's work and willingness to participate in these recovery tours when they come to your part of the state. We look forward to giving you an update at the next meeting.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your time today and your office as well. We appreciate that. If the members don't mind, I'd like to take about a 5-6 minute recess. I think we've been at this quite a bit, and everybody can refresh their coffee if they need to. And it is 10:22, maybe like about 5 minutes or so, and we'll see if we can get my self back up and running here. Thank you. Finance Office, and Leslie Molenkamp, the Federal Funds Coordinator with the Governor's Finance Office. And Director Brown, when you're ready, please go ahead, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, and good morning, Chair Gondaro Loop and subcommittee members. I am Susan Brown, the Director of the Governor's Finance Office, and I have here with me today Leslie Molenkamp, who is our Coronavirus Federal Aid Coordinator, and Shauna Tilley. She is our new American Rescue Plan Act Fiscal Recovery Fund lead. It is Shauna's second day on the job, so Leslie and I are going to do the heavy lifting today, but I wanted to take a moment to introduce her, as you will be seeing a lot more of her in the coming months. So we are here today as a resource to give a high-level overview of the American Rescue Plan Act dollars received by the state of Nevada so far. As Treasurer Conine shared earlier, there are 106 known buckets of ARPA funding expected to come into Nevada. A large amount of the ARPA dollars received so far has gone or will be going directly to our citizens, hospitals, businesses, and other places. However, today we are only going to focus on the funds that have come in specifically to the state's checking account through work programs. Currently, we expect 72 buckets of funding to come in directly to the state's checking account. More than half of these are yet to be received. Next slide. Since June of 2021, 25 work programs have gone before the IFC to accept ARPA funds, and 2 allocations were approved during the 81st legislative session. Various state agencies, including the Nevada Department of Education, the Department of Health and Human Services, Business and Industry, Veteran Services, Tourism and Cultural Affairs, and the Governor's Finance Office are all managing these funds. We are working with a wide range of federal partners to carry out the various programs, grants, and federal assistance, and you can see some of them listed here. For example, the U.S. Department of Treasury, the Department of Education, Health and Human Services, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Each of these federal partners is responsible for their own programs, and there is no single federal resource available where you can find this information collected in one spot. All of these 27 programs vary in their duration or performance period, as well as their uses. We are finding that several programs have the same allowances, so deciding what fund to use first is paramount, and we will be touching on that a little later. It should be noted that with 72 buckets of ARPA funds expected, it can be a little confusing if we refer to all of these allocations generally as ARPA funds. For this reason, we are going to try to reference each funding stream by its program name rather than as ARPA funding. Next slide. Here you can see all of the work programs that have gone before the IFC since June. Approximately $3.88 billion in federal ARPA direct payment or grant assistance has been received into the state's budget accounts through work programs, and we expect more to be heard at the next few upcoming IFC meetings. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Leslie Molenkamp, our Coronavirus Federal Aid Coordinator, to provide more details on the gray highlighted items that you see on this slide, the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery fund allocations. Leslie, Ms. Molenkamp.
Good morning, Chair Dondero Loop and subcommittee members. As Director Brown mentioned, our Nevada state agencies have received over $3.8 billion in ARPA funds to date, with more expected in the coming months. However, as you can see on this slide, a large portion of this amount comes from the ARPA coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds. We have highlighted the 2 related allocations in gray here on the list, and I will cover these allocations in depth next. So as Treasurer Conan and Director Brown mentioned, the state of Nevada is receiving its 2 largest allocations through the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. Local governments have been allocated just over $1 billion, and the state itself has received $2.74 billion. It's important to note that although the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund is often referenced as one fund, it is actually comprised of 2 parts, a local fiscal recovery fund and a state fiscal recovery fund. And I will be covering both in just a moment. Another very important distinction of this fund is that it shifts from providing emergency relief aid to recovery aid while still allowing for a pandemic response. So as a result, this is a much more complex and comprehensive federal aid program than the previous coronavirus relief fund. So I'm now going to quickly cover the local fiscal recovery fund to provide context as to what we can expect Nevada to receive from this part of the fund. The Treasury is providing direct payments to Nevada's counties and metropolitan cities, which consist of Carson City, Henderson, Las Vegas, North Las Vegas, Reno, and Sparks. And this means that our counties and larger cities do not have to go through the state to receive funds. They request the funds directly from the Treasury, and they work with them to receive the payment. This is a little different from the Coronavirus Relief Fund because most counties and cities previously had to receive their payments through the state. If all Nevada counties request funds, collectively they will receive over $1 billion. And if our larger cities all request their funds, they will receive a total of $292 million. Coronavirus local fiscal recovery funds for counties and metropolitan cities are released in two payments or tranches. It's our favorite word now. One which was made available immediately in the May or June timeframe, depending, and the other payment which will be sent out next summer. Unlike the Coronavirus Relief Fund, where many of these local governments had to report to the state on the use of the funds, reporting and compliance accountability is direct to the Treasury. It should be noted that although local fiscal recovery funds have a slightly different name, they actually play by the same rules as a state fiscal recovery fund. They have the exact same allowances and they have most of the same reporting requirements. So what about the smaller Nevada cities? Well, the Treasury identified a list of non-entitlement units of local governments, which we refer to as NEUs. These are typically cities serving populations of less than 50,000. And in Nevada, we have 13 NEU cities that were designated by the federal government to receive this aid. The award amounts are based on the population of the NEUs relative to the entire population of all 13 NEUs. In total, Nevada NEUs were allocated a maximum amount of $150.7 million. However, the funds were to be distributed through the state of Nevada instead of direct from the Treasury, like the counties and the larger metropolitan cities. But just like the counties and larger cities, the NEU payments are to be sent out in two tranches, with one payment to be made immediately and the other to be paid a year later. So the state of Nevada received the first NEU tranche of $75 million on June 16th and had 30 days to disperse the funds. And we are happy to say that Nevada was one of 17 states that did not ask for an extension. We were very proud of that. So with that being said, it should be noted for the most part, the state was simply dispersing the funds to the NEUs as more of a facilitator. However, as part of the state's responsibilities, the US Treasury directed that we were to request a reference budget from the NEUs, and we had to apply a 75% cap in which the NEUs could not exceed this amount for the total payment. The GFO worked with local governments to collect reference budgets, apply calculations, and ensure this requirement was met. Two NEUs received a lower than maximum payment due to this stipulation, and the excess funds must be returned to the Treasury. Now that we have covered the local fiscal recovery funds, we're going to shift now to the Coronavirus State Fiscal Recovery Fund. The state of Nevada received its $2.739 billion payment of state fiscal recovery funds on June 4th, 2021. Nevada qualified to receive a full payment of the state fiscal recovery funds rather than two tranches because of its high unemployment numbers. Reporting and oversight is conducted by the US Treasury, and unallowable expenses can be recouped and sent back to the Treasury. As stated before, the state funds follow the exact same allowances as the local fiscal recovery funds, and they also follow most of the same compliance rules. So in late May, award announcements were released prior to the end of the 81st legislative session. This allowed the legislature to appropriate some of the Arpa state fiscal recovery funds for very specific programs and initiatives. The column on the left here summarizes the programs that were funded through the 81st session legislation as well as the specific order of priority is directed through Senate Bill 461. And as you can see, the very first item on the list is the transfer of lost revenue to the general fund. One very significant allowance for the fiscal recovery funds is the ability for a recipient to use the funds for government services to the extent the reduction of revenue experienced due to the COVID-19 public health emergency. So in other words, to put it in a little bit more plain language, the allowance is to be able to recover the lost revenue that was experienced due to the pandemic. The Treasury provided a very specific calculation to determine what this amount is. And as you can see here for the state of Nevada, it is the 1.08 billion of revenue that was lost due to the pandemic and can now be recovered with the state fiscal recovery funds. The rest of the items you see here on the list are the ARPA Fiscal Recovery Fund allocations that were directed through the 81st session legislation. And I'd like to call out that the items on this list that you see here in more of a light yellow color, these are the items that are currently under review to ensure allocations meet the eligibility requirements of the fund. And this may answer, hopefully, the question that Assemblywoman Tolles had earlier. These are currently going under eligibility review and also to ensure that they adhere to specific requirements of any kind of legislation. Now, the Governor's Finance Office is working with any entity that is to receive funding through these allocations to collect the data and information for required reporting and compliance as directed by Treasury. And as we mentioned before, and I believe Treasurer Conan also mentioned this, touched on this, this fund is far more complex and comprehensive in its structure than our previous coronavirus relief fund. And as a result, we must collect much more information and data than we had to before. So our goal in this office is to streamline this process and to make it as efficient as possible. And we're working on that right now to do that and also work with our partners to collect that information. So if you look at the right-hand column, you're going to see that all of these waterfall allocations and any future allocations of the remaining ARPA State Fiscal Recovery Fund dollars will go through the framework process. And as you can see here, although we did see a substantial amount of funds that were allocated through the 81st session, it still goes through the Every Nevadan Recovery Framework process. Because as we've mentioned before, many initiatives have the same allowance for multiple funding streams while others do not. And so we will be evaluating what funds are to be used first and what initiatives have already been funded. And we are basically collecting this information for this analysis through the framework process. Our allocations from the 81st session will be a part of that overall evaluation. We've outlined the steps of the framework process here, and you can see that a key part of this is step number 3, which calls for mapping all eligible ARPA funds, all of them that we know of. And then step number 4 is pairing the best source of funding for that initiative. So that's what we would like to do through the framework process. The recovery roadmap will collect this analysis together and hopefully to be a very useful tool for looking at new and existing priorities and evaluating funding considerations. So at this point, what I would like to do is just to emphasize one more time that any kind of suggestions for use of the funds really should be routed through the Nevada Recovers website, and that is nevadarecovers.com. And anyone who is interested in providing ideas or suggestions should definitely get that information into and collected into the website portal so that we can use this and definitely make sure that it is addressed in the framework process. So at this point in time, this concludes our presentation of the ARPA funds received, and we are happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much for that information. And I will ask, let's see, I see Assemblywoman Tolles. Please go ahead.
Thank you. And I do appreciate you referencing back to my question. I think it's on slide 28 that you were referring to, the light yellow sections. And is that eligibility review subject to the latest Treasury guidance that we're still waiting to receive that Emily was referring to from NCSL, or is it something else?
Leslie Mollenkamp, for the record. Basically, we do know with this particular, with that particular question and that particular allocation, we look for the eligibility first and foremost, but with this particular legislation, there are some certain areas that are called out within AB 495. We do know that the funding is to be used to augment programs. And we also know, and this is put into the legislation, we also know that per the legislation, to qualify for such a grant, a school district or a charter school or university school must describe how the entity has expended or plans to expend its allocation of federal funding from all of the ESSER funds that have been received and all of the GEAR funds that have been received. And I believe, as Treasurer Conan had mentioned before, some of those funding that were going out, especially through ESSER, had to be pre-approved. And so I believe that at this point in time, most of the charter schools and the school districts should be at the point where they would be able to demonstrate that this allocation would be to augment the programs and basically to demonstrate funding gaps in existing literacy and at-risk programming. So there were a few pieces that had to be in place in order for them to effectively answer that.
So we're getting follow-up, Madam Chair.
Please go ahead.
So if I hear you correctly, we had to demonstrate how we were using some of the other dollars first before we could utilize this, but we're getting closer to those steps to be able to utilize that funds, because obviously the concern is the learning loss. In particular, I'll camp out on that one, but I would also say the same would go for Dieter's IT and so forth. Those needs are immediate. We're already mid-semester in the fall, and the idea was to try and get them back up to speed as quickly as possible as they come back to school to make up for the learning loss over the last year and a half. So I'm hearing you that we're getting close.
This is Leslie Mollenkamp, for the record. Yes, I do believe we're getting close. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that in order to be able to demonstrate that funding gap, you have to have your funds mapped. And so I do believe that we're at the point right now where school districts and charter schools will be more effectively be able to do that.
And would the same go for the Dieter's IT program, or certainly when we see things like food insecurity, there's a lot of concern there for people getting access to food, basic needs. Are we in the same boat with some of those other ones?
Leslie Mollenkamp, for the record. I think each individual allocation is going to have its own set of considerations. And so really, again, we look for eligibility first and foremost, but we also have a lot of fairly extensive reporting requirements. One of the things that is called out is that programs, they have to demonstrate a lot of data, a lot of information that we absolutely have to collect from the entities that receive the allocation. So for example, they have to have some key outcome goals. They have to have some descriptions of efforts to date and intended outcomes to promote equity. These are some things that we haven't seen before with the Coronavirus Relief Fund. I'll give another example, use of evidence. So this is, because that is a lot more complex information, we are trying to put together a structure that's fairly efficient to be able to send that out to whatever entity received the allocation and effectively collect that data, but also quickly, because that is absolutely a priority for this office as well.
Thank you. I think Assemblywoman Carlton's going to pick up where I left off. When people are hungry, it's hard to wait for a process. But I appreciate that you didn't create that those requirements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Additional questions? Assemblywoman Carlton, did you have a question?
Yes, Madam Chair, and I am going to be picking up where Assemblywoman Toles left off, because I did see food assistance in the yellow, but I did see on the treasurer's pie chart, the food assistance line was fairly thin. Economic development actually had more money than food assistance had. So I'm just trying to figure out. So we've got that on the treasurer's pie chart, that there's food assistance dollars ready, are available. Then we have the bill, and I had concerns about putting some of these items in this bill because I was afraid it might slow it up. So we're trying to figure out how we do the food assistance part of it. And it's not just the food assistance, it's the transportation that's involved. It's the storage that's involved. It's not just the purchase of food. There's a lot that goes into getting food from one place to another to make sure the family has access to it. So I just want to make sure that I understand how that pie chart and then this designation for those dollars fit, because there is still a huge need for food in the community right now. And I just want to make sure we don't miss our opportunity to make sure that dollars get out there when they're really needed.
Leslie Mollenkamp for the record. I think that's a very great question. The pie chart that was demonstrated earlier does represent all of the different funding streams. So there should be, multiple funding streams that make up that particular slice of the pie. For the $7.6 million allocation, that will only be one of the many that make up the food assistance. So definitely, in working with our state agencies, what we want to be able to do is to actually address that as well, to be able to make sure that these funds are going out expediently, but also addressing where basically the gaps, if any of those other funding streams don't cover something in particular, we want to be able to be very smart about and strategic about being able to use those funds, but while also not slowing down the process. So I know that's that fine line between trying to use it strategically, but also being able to not slow down the process. Absolutely. And again, that's our priority as well, is to make sure to get those out very quickly as fast as we can.
And thank you. And I really appreciate that. And Thanksgiving is literally right around the corner. So is Christmas, and the slow time for Las Vegas is coming up. There will be more people who do need food. So we do need to get this figured out and taken care of so that our major food banks in the state can get prepared. It takes time to maneuver this amount of food when you're bringing in semi-trucks full of food. So I just hope that we can get this resolved to make sure that our two largest food banks in the state have the resources that they need to be able to provide the assistance to the Nevadans that need help right now. So thank you very much. I appreciate you keeping an eye on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. Additional questions from the committee anywhere? If I don't see you, just let me know. All right, I do not believe I see any additional questions. And so with that, I would thank the governor's office for being with us today, and welcome to the team. Ms. Tilley, we're happy to have you, and thank you so much for the presentation. We appreciate that. So we will now go into our second and last period of public comment on the agenda. And because of the time considerations, each person offering that public comment will be given 2 minutes. So to join the meeting and make public comment, please follow the instructions outlined in the agenda for today's meeting. And BPS, when you're ready and you see someone there, please let us know.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. We are currently on public comment. If you would like to provide public comment, please press *9 to take your place in the queue. Thank you. Caller with the last 3 digits, 837, please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You have 2 minutes and may begin.
Hello, This is Kent Irvin, K-E-N-T-E-R-V-I-N, for the Nevada Faculty Alliance, the independent association of faculty at the public colleges and universities of Nevada. As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, state workers were given furloughs and their public employees benefits program benefits were drastically cut and employee premiums were increased. $25 million was withdrawn from PEB in FY 2021 through an employer-only premium holiday, and new budget cuts were made for this biennium. Out-of-pocket maximums and deductibles have increased sharply, shifting the cost from the health plan to the employee. Our constituents have, of course, heard about the $2.7 billion in state funds under the Coronavirus State Fiscal Recovery Fund, including the $1.1 billion in revenue shortfall funds that were transferred to the general fund. They also read that gaming revenues and taxes have recovered and reached all-time highs. They don't understand why no action has been taken on restoring the cuts to benefits to our state employees. Healthcare needs don't wait. The revenue shortfall funds in Arpa are explicitly intended to fill temporary budget holes resulting from COVID-19. We were told during the 2021 session that Arpa funds could not be expended until received, but it has now been 4 months since the state got its $2.7 billion check. Treasurer Conine indicated today that you may rely on Treasury's interim guidance to make decisions now. In the meantime, PEB will have to approve plan design for FY 2023 beginning next July at its November meeting. That's next month. PEB urgently needs authorizations of ARPA funds in order to fully restore benefits for FY 2023. Why should state employees suffer for another year when all these funds have been received and are being held in the general fund? Of course, these questions also apply to the unrestored operating budget cuts for all other state agencies, including NSHE. Thank you for your time.
Chair,
Thank
the
you very
public
much.
line. I'm so sorry. I apologize for interrupting.
That's okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. The public line is open and working. However, there are no additional public comment callers at this time. Would you like to take a couple of moments to see if anyone watching online has time to call in?
Yes, and while we're doing that, I believe Senator Brooks had some comments that he would like to make. Senator Brooks, would you like to do that now, or would you like us to wait until we wait for public callers?
Please just wait till after public comment.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you so much, Chair Don Darrell Loop. The public line is open and working, and we have no additional public comment callers at this time.
Thank you so much for doing that, and we appreciate that. Senator Brooks, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Don Darrell Loop. I just wanted to say that this has been incredible information today, and I think it was very helpful for all the members and the general public to kind of see the processes all in one place. And it's exactly what I envisioned when I worked with leadership to create this subcommittee. And I just want to thank you, Chair, for putting this together, and thank all of the presenters. They just did a fantastic job. And I look forward to tracking progress as we move along.
I couldn't agree more, and thank you for those comments. And I will ditto those very same comments. We will be having another meeting. We are working with fiscal staff to make sure that we do it in alignment with our IFC. So while I'd love to give you an exact date today, I do not have one. So we will get with you as soon as we can, as soon as we put all the moving pieces and parts together in the puzzle. And we will definitely have a follow-up meeting before the end of the year. So please stay tuned for that. With no other, unless somebody else has another comment they would like to make, I would like to adjourn this very first meeting of the Interim Finance Committee Subcommittee to advise on the expenditure of federal COVID-19 federal funding, relief funding. And with that, we are adjourned. And thank you, members, for taking your time today. And thank you to the public.